You know, there's a certain kind of power in silence. A kind of power the world doesn't talk about much anymore. We live in a noisy world, always rushing, always striving. But let me ask you, what if the key to divine alignment, to real peace, to the deepest form of success, isn't in doing more? What if it's in stepping back, in listening, in honoring a sacred pause that was never meant to be optional? The Sabbath is not a restriction. It's a divine rhythm that unlocks clarity, creativity, and spiritual alignment. Most people, when they first hear about the Sabbath, think of rules, limitations, and what they can't do. But that's only because they've been taught to see it through a lens of lack. What if, instead, it was a gift, a sacred structure designed not to hold us back but to lift us up? Every high achiever, every spiritually grounded person has one thing in common. They understand the power of intentional pause. It's not about stopping for the sake of stopping. It's about creating space for something higher to move through you. That's what the Sabbath is. It's a pause with purpose. We live in a culture that glorifies hustle. The busier you are, the more valuable you seem. But this thinking is backward. Constant activity without alignment leads to burnout, confusion, and shallow success. The Sabbath invites us to stop, not because the work isn't important, but because we are not machines. We are spiritual beings with a divine design, and our souls crave connection to the source. That connection is strengthened when we follow the rhythm God set in motion from the very beginning. 6 days of creating, 1 day of resting. Not just resting, but realigning, remembering, and renewing. When you honor that rhythm, you don't lose time. You gain vision. You don't fall behind, you rise above. There's something incredible that happens when you step into the Sabbath with the right mindset. Your mind starts to clear. Thoughts that were jumbled and heavy begin to sort themselves. Answers you were striving to find during the week suddenly arrive with ease. Inspiration begins to flow where stress once lived. It's like tuning an instrument. If you keep playing without ever stopping to tune, the music eventually becomes noise. But when you pause and adjust, everything comes back into harmony. The Sabbath is God's invitation to tune your life. And it's not just mental clarity, it's creative energy. How many people have ideas trapped beneath exhaustion? How many breakthroughs are being delayed because there's no space for them to land? The Sabbath opens the space. It honors the silence where new things are born. Some of the most profound insights don't come in the rush, but in the rest. That's where the divine can speak, and that's where you can truly listen. You begin to see things differently. You see your work not as a grind, but as a calling. You see people not as obstacles, but as divine appointments. Your perspective shifts from striving. Spiritual alignment is the ultimate goal. The Sabbath isn't just a physical rest. It's a realignment of the soul with the Creator. In that space, ego melts. Fear loses its grip. You realize you were never meant to carry it all alone. You begin to operate not from force, but from flow. You move with divine timing instead of human pressure. And as a result, your entire week changes. You start your week fueled, not drained, anchored, not scattered. You stop living in reaction and start living in intention. You stop hustling for worth and start walking in purpose. All of that begins with a simple truth. The Sabbath was made for man, not to limit, but to liberate. True productivity is born from rest. God's design for the Sabbath fuels, not hinders, human potential. This idea runs counter to the culture most people are conditioned by, where success is measured by how much one can do, how fast one can go, and how long one can endure without stopping. But divine wisdom has never been aligned with burnout. In fact, creation itself was completed with rest. On the seventh day, God didn't collapse from exhaustion. He ceased from labor to declare the work very good and to establish a cycle that humanity was meant to mirror. The Sabbath was not tacked onto the end of creation. It was woven into its core. The world often teaches that rest is what you do when you're done working, as though it's a reward for finishing. But from a higher perspective, rest is not the end of work. It's the foundation of it. When you rest the way God designed, something remarkable happens. You stop relying solely on your own strength and begin to tap into a deeper reservoir of energy, focus, and intent. You stop pushing for outcomes and start positioning yourself to receive insight. That shift from self-reliance to spiritual synchronization is what transforms ordinary effort into extraordinary impact. There is a law of diminishing returns that kicks in when people ignore rest. The more they push, the less effective they become. Mental fatigue sets in. Emotional clarity fades. Decision-making suffers. But when the Sabbath is honored, the mind recalibrates. The body begins to heal. The spirit becomes attentive. It's not just about ceasing labor. It's about entering into a sacred space where alignment replaces anxiety and intention replaces impulsiveness. The Sabbath is like a divine pit stop in the race of life. It's where refueling happens. It's where the engine is checked and recalibrated so that when you return to the race, you don't just move, you move with power and direction. Productivity in its highest form is not about doing more things. It's about doing the right things with the right energy at the right time. The Sabbath builds that wisdom into your life. It teaches discernment. It trains the soul to pause and ask, is this aligned with my purpose? Rather than rushing into busyness for the sake of appearances. And in doing so, it increases effectiveness far beyond what frantic activity can achieve. It multiplies what matters by pruning what doesn't. It sharpens your ability to focus on what truly deserves your time. God's design is never random. When He ordained the Sabbath, He wasn't creating a burdensome rule. He was offering a divine strategy. A strategy to sustain not just the body, but the spirit. A strategy that keeps ambition from becoming idolatry. A rhythm that protects you from the lie that your worth is tied to your output. The Sabbath reminds you that you are valuable not because of what you do, but because of who you are. And that identity is most clearly remembered in the stillness of divine rest. Those who tap into this truth don't slow down. They accelerate with purpose. They rise on Monday with a strength the world can't explain. Their work becomes more inspired, more intentional, and more impactful. And it's not just about what gets done. It's about how it gets done. The spirit in which you labor matters as much as the labor itself. And when you come from a place of rest, your presence changes the atmosphere around you. You carry peace into chaos. You bring clarity to confusion. You don't just perform, you transform the environment you touch. Silence is not absence, it's presence. The Sabbath is where God's voice becomes loudest in stillness. Most people equate silence with a void, a lack of activity, a kind of emptiness. But silence in the biblical and spiritual sense is far from empty. It is full. It is rich. It is alive with the presence of something deeper, something higher. In a world addicted to noise, silence feels uncomfortable. We fill our days with music, talking, scrolling, watching, always needing some form of stimulation to avoid the discomfort of quiet. Yet it's in that very quiet where some of the most powerful transformations take place. The Sabbath, at its core, is an invitation into that quiet space, not just externally, but internally. When you step into the Sabbath with intention, you're not just stepping away from work. You're stepping into sacred territory. This is the space where the inner world gets louder than the outer one. It's the moment when the still, small voice of God is no longer drowned out by deadlines, distractions, and the demands of the week. The world may interpret silence as nothing happening, but spiritually, silence is where everything begins to happen. It's the moment when divine ideas start to emerge, when conviction gets clearer, and when conviction begins to unravel. It's where the soul can finally breathe. Throughout Scripture, God often spoke in quiet places. He met prophets in caves, spoke through dreams, revealed his will in the solitude of wilderness. He didn't need a stage or a spectacle. He needed a willing heart, a still environment, a space unpolluted by constant motion. The Sabbath is like a weekly sanctuary, built into the fabric of time itself. It carves out a space where we can listen not just with our ears, but with our spirit. And in that space, we begin to discern not just what's urgent, but what's eternal. People often wonder why they feel spiritually dry or disconnected, even when they're doing all the right external things. The truth is, spiritual dryness isn't always the result of doing too little. It's often the result of hearing too little. And hearing is only possible when we're quiet enough to listen. The Sabbath is not passive. It's deeply active in the realm of the Spirit. It's the fertile ground where God's voice takes root and begins to bear fruit. It's where clarity comes, not through effort, but through presence. It's where battles are won, not by strategy, but by surrender. When we create intentional silence through the Sabbath, we begin to notice things we missed all week. We see beauty in simplicity. We recognize patterns in our thoughts that need shifting. We feel burdens we've been carrying that are not ours to bear. This kind of awareness doesn't come from pushing harder. It comes from stepping back, from observing, from sitting with God long enough to hear not just what he's saying, but what he's not saying. His silence is not neglect. It's invitation. It draws us deeper. It calls us higher. In the stillness of the Sabbath, your relationship with God becomes less about ritual and more about intimacy. You stop striving to reach him and start realizing he's already here. You stop begging for answers and begin to sense the peace that surpasses understanding. Silence becomes your teacher, your healer, your compass. And in that silence, you're reminded of something powerful. God has not forgotten you. He's been speaking all along. The noise just made it hard to hear. The Sabbath clears the air, tunes the frequency, and brings you back to center. It reconnects you to the one who speaks worlds into being, not always with thunder, but often with a whisper. Breaking the Sabbath disconnects us from our highest self, our divine calling, and our spiritual inheritance. It's not just about skipping a day of rest. It's about stepping out of alignment with a divine pattern designed for our growth, clarity, and fulfillment. When something is designed by God, it carries with it a built-in order, a purpose that transcends human reasoning. The Sabbath is not just a commandment, it's a covenant. It's a link between the Creator and the created, a weekly reminder of who we are, whose we are, and why we're here. To disregard it is not simply a matter of missing a spiritual appointment. It's severing ourselves from a rhythm that sustains identity and purpose. Modern life often encourages constant motion. Success is equated with hustle, and self-worth gets tied to output. In this frantic environment, the Sabbath becomes a revolutionary act, a declaration that we are not slaves to the clock, to the market, or to the expectations of others. But when we fail to honor the Sabbath, we unconsciously re-enter that slavery. We allow the noise to define us, the pressure to shape us, and the world's metrics to measure us. In doing so, we drift from our higher self, the version of us that was designed to operate in alignment with heaven's pace, not the world's rush. Our highest self is not the most productive version of us. It's not the busiest or even the most accomplished. It's the version of us that is rooted in peace, clarity, and truth. The Sabbath is the soil that nurtures this version. It grounds us, not just physically, but spiritually. It reminds us that we are not defined by the grind. We are defined by our connection to something eternal. The further we drift from that connection, the more we begin to feel fragmented, anxious, and empty. We chase goals that don't fulfill us. We perform for approval rather than walk in assurance. We start to confuse activity with purpose, and in doing so, lose sight of our divine calling. That calling isn't something we have to earn. It's something we must protect. It's fragile in the noise, but it thrives in the quiet. It's easy to forget that our calling is not just about what we do. It's about who we become. The Sabbath allows us to stop long enough to ask, am I becoming the person God designed me to be? Without that pause, we risk becoming excellent at things that don't matter and successful in areas that leave our soul bankrupt. The world will always applaud motion, but heaven honors alignment. And alignment can only happen when we regularly turn to the source. The Sabbath is more than just rest. It's inheritance. It carries blessings that are not available in constant motion. It offers a kind of clarity that comes only when the soul is still. It reveals insights that hustle blinds us from seeing. It restores not only energy, but vision. And when we ignore it, we don't just lose a day. We lose access to something sacred. We miss the divine refresh that realigns us with our mission and opens the flow of grace into our lives. We disconnect from the rhythm of heaven and begin operating on the rhythm of fear, scarcity, and survival. This disconnection has consequences. It affects our peace, our health, our relationships, and our ability to hear God's voice. We may still function outwardly, but inwardly we become dull, fatigued, and misdirected. The Sabbath was never about religious obligation. It was about spiritual preservation. It was God's way of saying, I want to walk with you every week, uninterrupted. When we ignore that invitation, we lose more than time. We lose alignment with the very essence of who we're called to be. The most powerful transformations happen not in doing more, but in surrendering to divine order. There is a tendency in human nature to believe that change comes through force, through constant effort, through pushing against every barrier until something breaks open. This belief is reinforced by a world that rewards exhaustion, that praises those who grind the hardest, and that equates stillness with laziness. But in spiritual truth, transformation is not born out of chaos. It is born out of alignment. It is born in moments when the soul yields, when the striving stops, and when we step into the flow of something greater than ourselves. The Sabbath is a sacred gateway into this kind of surrender. God's design has always included a rhythm of rest, not as a reaction to weariness, but as a proactive act of trust. When you rest on the Sabbath, you're not just ceasing from labor. You're declaring with your actions that you trust the divine order more than your own urgency. You're saying that the Creator knows more about time, success, and growth than your calendar does. That act of surrender is not passive. It is immensely powerful. It's where fear begins to dissolve, where stress releases its grip, and where the mind is freed from the constant loop of trying to control everything. Transformation doesn't come from more information or more activity. It comes from revelation. And revelation doesn't shout over noise. It emerges in stillness. The Sabbath is where that stillness lives. It becomes the sacred container for insight, for perspective shifts, and for spiritual realignment. In the silence of surrender, the things that really matter come into focus. Priorities get reshuffled, not because we force them to, but because clarity rises naturally when we are in sync with the divine rhythm. The idea that letting go could be more effective than pressing forward feels counterintuitive. Yet that is exactly the principle woven throughout Scripture and spiritual law. When Moses stood at the Red Sea, it wasn't more action that split the waters. It was obedience and surrender to a divine instruction. When Jesus performed miracles, it wasn't through frantic effort. It was through alignment with the Father's will. These moments teach us something profound. Power flows where surrender is present. The Sabbath trains us to live from that space, not in rare emergencies, but as a regular rhythm of life. Every time we enter the Sabbath with the intent to surrender, we strengthen our capacity to hear, to receive, and to act from purpose instead of panic. We move from reactive living to intentional living. We stop measuring our worth by our output and begin to discover the freedom that comes with resting in God's provision. This shift is not small. It is foundational. It creates space in our inner world for healing, for vision, and for a deeper sense of self that is not defined by performance, but by presence. In surrendering to the Sabbath, we begin to taste what it means to live from overflow instead of depletion. We stop surviving the week and start anchoring it. We stop dragging ourselves forward and start moving with grace. This divine order that begins with rest and flows into action is not just a principle. It's a blueprint. It's how God created the world and how He intends us to live within it. Each time we align with that order, we find ourselves not diminished, but elevated. We experience a kind of transformation that is sustainable, grounded, and rich with spiritual depth. We begin to notice that the more we surrender, the more clearly we see, the more peacefully we act, and the more powerfully we live. The Sabbath truth has echoed through time because truth doesn't expire. It simply waits to be rediscovered. Across centuries, cultures, and religious traditions, the principle of sacred rest has never vanished. It may have been buried beneath modern distractions, distorted by misunderstanding, or dismissed by those too busy to notice, but it has never ceased calling out. Truth, by its very nature, cannot be destroyed. It lives in the foundation of creation, in the heartbeat of divine wisdom, and in the still spaces of the human soul. The Sabbath is not a passing tradition. It is an eternal message embedded in the structure of time itself. Every generation has had the opportunity to hear it, to respond, to return. Some have listened and flourished in alignment with it. Others have ignored it and paid the price through burnout, spiritual emptiness, and disconnection. But the invitation remains open. The seventh day has not lost its power. Its relevance is not reduced by changing calendars or evolving cultures. If anything, in a world overrun by speed and noise, the truth of the Sabbath stands taller than ever, a reminder that there is a better way to live, a deeper way to connect, a higher way to operate. People search endlessly for peace, for meaning, for the missing piece that will bring their lives into balance. They try strategies, systems, and philosophies, often bypassing the very principle that was given freely from the beginning. The Sabbath is that principle. It was not created as a burden, but as a blessing, a rhythm of renewal, a pause with a purpose, not man-made, but God-breathed. And it has endured because it holds something eternal. You can't erase what God has declared as holy. You can choose to ignore it, but its truth remains, unchanged and unyielding. History has shown that when the Sabbath is honored, individuals, families, and even entire societies are strengthened, not because of legalism, but because of the power of alignment. The principle works because it was designed to. Just as gravity doesn't need belief to function, the Sabbath doesn't need approval to be true. It simply is. And those who return to it don't just find rest, they find a reconnection to something far greater than themselves. They rediscover their place in a larger story, a divine story that has been unfolding since the beginning of time. There's something deeply humbling about realizing that we don't have to create the path, we just have to walk in it. The Sabbath is not a new revelation. It's an ancient one, waiting like a buried treasure beneath the chaos of modern life. And those who dig for it with sincerity always find more than they expected. They find healing in the stillness. They find direction in the quiet. They find peace in the letting go. Not because they discovered something novel, but because they finally heard what had been echoing all along. That echo reaches through generations. It speaks to the overworked, the overwhelmed, the spiritually hungry. It calls to the achiever, the seeker, the wanderer. It whispers a truth that defies time, that rest is not weakness, that silence is not empty, that alignment is more powerful than effort. This truth does not beg for attention. It does not compete with trends. It simply waits, patient, steady, timeless. And when someone finally slows down long enough to listen, when they pull back from the noise and honor the divine invitation to pause, they step into something that transcends schedules and surpasses understanding. This is why the Sabbath truth continues to echo, because deep down, every soul remembers, every heart longs for the rhythm it was created to follow. And no matter how far one drifts, that truth keeps calling. Not with condemnation, but with compassion. Not with pressure, but with promise. It waits not to punish, but to restore. It does not expire because truth by its very nature is eternal.